Backyard chickens have been exploding because of the pandemic and everyone wants chickens.
Wait.
Yeah.
Not literally exploding.
Not literally exploding.
Demand
no,
for.
the phenomenon, demand for. Yeah, sorry, no, chickens are not exploding.
Welcome once again to Free Associations from the Boston University School of Public Health, the Public Health and Medical Journal Club podcast for anyone who is as confused by the latest health study as I am by why vaccination rates are so low in healthcare workers. What exactly is going on? And the reason why I bring this up is I had a conversation with my mother recently in which she went to a healthcare provider who actually advised her not to get vaccinated. I shouldn't say that. Advised anyone who is under the age of 50 not to get vaccinated, which really took me aback to hear that a healthcare provider would say this. And so I'm just really dumbfounded as to how vaccination rates for COVID can be so, not that they're like low, but that they're lower than you would expect for healthcare workers.
Well, I'm going to go one step further, Matt. A close friend of ours had a double tragedy this week.
I know.
She's from Canada, and her elderly parents, who were 99 and 100 years respectively, living up in Ottawa, had not been able to get vaccinated. And they both got COVID-19 brought into the home by the home health aide, and they both died.
Oh, that's terrible.
Jeez. That's terrible, Chris.
So I'm thinking, like, how in the world is it that home health aides of the elderly are allowed not to be vaccinated?
Right.
Good question.
This is like the thing that people talk about in abstract, but here it is. It's not very abstract at all, and totally avoidable.
Totally avoidable. Well, I didn't mean to begin the podcast on such a downer, but so I'll switch to something happier then, which is that we got another 5-star rating.
Oh, really?
We did. Let me read this one to you. So this one is from Andrew Masucci in the US. And this says, I found this podcast fairly recently, and as an aspiring epidemiologist with an interest in non-communicable disease, I have particularly appreciated the variety of topics still discussed throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. I really enjoyed the most recent episode related to concussion testing. So, pretty cool.
That's great.
Well done, everybody.
That's great.
Yeah, thank you.
So now on to the show. So today in our first segment, which is our Journal Club segment, we're going to look at a study of a drug for treatment of obesity. Then in the second part of the podcast, which is our deep dive, we'll talk about whether or not, and if so, why, Africa needs local solutions to the COVID-19 pandemic. And then in our last segment, which is our Amazing and Amusing, we'll get into some things that made us laugh out loud or things that we found fascinating. So let's jump right in with segment one. So we're going to talk about an article, as I said, that looked at the effect of a drug for treatment of obesity. It was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, JAMA, and it was entitled The Effect of Continued Weekly Subcutaneous Semaglutide. How do I pronounce it? Anyone know?
As good as I can guess.
I think it's semaglutide. I had to look it up. But yes,
semaglutide versus placebo on weight loss maintenance in adults with overweight or obesity. The Step 4 randomized clinical trial by first author Dominica Rubino of the Washington Center for Weight Management in Arlington, Virginia. My understanding is that, say it again, Jess, semaglutide?
Semaglutide, I think.
That semaglutide is also known as Ozempic.
Yeah.
Which is, I know the commercials for, because I watch way too much television during the pandemic, so I know the theme songs or the jingles for all of these drugs. Oh, Ozempic. Anyway, shouldn't give them free advertising. Shouldn't give them free advertising, but I do know this drug because, of course, this is a drug that is already approved for use for treatment of diabetes. So it's not a new drug specifically, but they were testing this as a drug for weight loss. And I should say it was a really sort of a testing not just whether or not it could lead to weight loss, because they knew that already, but whether or not ending treatment for with this particular drug would lead to sustained weight loss. A few headlines on this one. So MedPage today says, maintenance semaglutide keeps shedding the pounds. MD Magazine says semaglutide helps curb obesity, weight problems. And Medscape says ongoing semaglutide treatment extends weight loss in step 4, which, given you don't know what really step 4 means, I thought that was not the greatest of headlines. But anyway, I will leave that to the headline writers and turn it over to you, Jess, to tell us what they did in this study and what they found.
Sure. So basically, as we all know, the context here, obesity and overweight are critical public health problems, and many of the interventions that are used to try to stem obesity and overweight are not very effective in the long term. And so there has been, as we know, gastric bypass and gastric sleeve is probably one of the few interventions that have really succeeded in kind of turning the tide in some of these circumstances. And so the question here is, can the use of this medicine, semaglutide, here they're using it as an injection, although I think in certain contexts it also can be used as a pill. Maybe that's the difference between the two medications. But what they tried here was the injectable version of it. And so the question is, can an injection of semaglutide taken once a week alongside lifestyle interventions improve weight loss and weight maintenance among people who are obese and overweight? And so this component of the study has been takes place in the context of this larger step 4 study, which is looking at both the effect of this pill at higher doses. And so this particular study is kind of looking at maintenance after this initial run-in period. Is there maintenance and continuation of weight loss after the dose is dialed down? So let's get into some of the details. So this was a randomized double-blind clinical trial. It lasted 68 weeks and recruited and enrolled obese and overweight people without diabetes. And this is of note, as Matt mentioned, so this medication is primarily used, it's an anti-diabetic medication and increases insulin secretion, so increases sugar metabolism. And so that's kind of the mechanism as to what is going on here. There were 803 people who were followed in this study. The study design was a little bit complex in that it involved this 20-week run-in period to try to, at the end of the run-in period, have a standardized dosing among the participants who continued on for this segment of the study where they looked at maintenance, and also to focus on participants who were able to tolerate the medicine. So there were 16 weeks of dose escalation, and then 4 weeks of maintenance dosing to reach this optimal dosing, 2.4 milligrams per week. And then after this run-in period, the participants were randomized 2-to-1 to 48 weeks of continued treatment, 535 of them, or placebo plus lifestyle intervention. So that was 268. So there was a 2-to-1, twice as many participants in the semaglutide arm compared to the intervention arm. And this study takes place after that run-in period, looking at the period of weekly maintenance dosing compared to placebo. Both groups received lifestyle intervention. The core outcome was % change in body weight from week 20 to week 68. They also looked at change in waist circumference, systolic blood pressure, and physical functioning as measured from the SF-36. So what they found, interesting, continued treatment with semaglutide resulted in additional mean body weight loss among participants in the group of people who received semaglutide injections once a week after that initial study phase, where they had a mean body weight change of negative 7.9. So that meant that they continued to lose weight during this period of maintenance semaglutide injections, compared to an increase in 6.9% in mean body weight change among participants who were receiving placebo and the lifestyle treatment. So the people in the placebo group gained weight through this period after this initial evaluation of the study in the run-in period, where participants in the semaglutide group continued to lose weight. And they saw improvements too in waist circumference, blood pressure, and physical functioning. One of the interesting things that's about this study was the adverse effects. Well, I'm sure we'll talk about that later. There were a lot of gastrointestinal adverse effects reported among the participants, which suggests that maybe a lot of people don't tolerate this medicine very well. So maybe it's not a kind of a cure-all. It's not necessarily going to work for all people. if it relates to a lot of, causes a lot of GI events. And so their conclusion is that the treatment of semaglutide in this way, kind of in a maintenance way, over a longer period of time, could continue to help obese and overweight people maintain weight loss and continue to lose weight in a way that these shorter term interventions, as we saw in the placebo group, participants tend to lose weight, tend to gain back weight after the intervention is over. One of the interesting things that I will let the two of you talk about, because I don't work in clinical trials, was they use this Estimand approach, which I thought was kind of neat, kind of, in lieu of the intention to treat approach. And so I thought they did that nicely. They kind of engaged this. My understanding is it's this kind of newish approach to kind of standardize the way comparisons are made in clinical trials, but I don't know a whole lot about the details. But I was reading through it, and it was nice to see how they laid out their different analyses.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting too. I can't say I totally followed all of it, but I agree with you. They were sort of trying to do this, what I thought of as more of actually a per protocol type analysis, and using some of the more newly developed methods for doing this rather than the old methods that we would use, where you just say per protocol, we just put everybody in the groups of what they actually did, and we pretend like that's not problematic in terms of confounding and bias. So, Chris, what was your take on this study?
Yeah, fascinating study with all sorts of sort of astonishing implications, really. And I'll start with, I guess, the biggest take home, which is that when you look at the history of pharmacological interventions for weight loss, it's been pretty grim, right? You'll see individuals who lose, 2 or 3 pounds, and then they gain it right back again. And the medication is filled with side effects. And so it's really a very poor risk benefit ratio. But here we're talking about, if you add up the run in and then the continued use of the drug, it approached about 20% weight loss at just over a year, which is a lot. And I'll remind people who may not know, but that, as a clinician, if someone came to me and said that, they had lost 10% of their body weight and they couldn't really explain how, I'd be working them up for cancer at that point. Mm-hmm. So like a 10% loss and drop in body weight is a huge clinical event. A 20% drop in body weight due to a medication is a game changer. So that's really remarkable. But it did not come for free. As Jess noted, there were all sorts of side effects. And this is also interesting because it tells you that the pharmacology of this drug is not quite so straightforward as they imply in the introduction, which is that it increases insulin secretion. Because if for those of you who have taken care of patients with type 2 diabetes, you know that when you start someone on insulin, because they have failed oral hypoglycemics, what you're going to see is that their blood sugar will come down, but their weight is going to go up, because insulin is a storage hormone, right? And so it's interesting that here that we have a mechanism of action that uses insulin as part of the pathway, but leads to weight loss. And so there's much more to this story than just insulin. I think it seems that they're implying that it has a lot to do with a change in one's appetite, and also a change in the propulsive behavior of the gastrointestinal tract. And so it has all sorts of physiological effects, which is not surprising, because glucagon is a very complicated hormone that does lots of things in the body, one of which is to stimulate insulin production. But there's much more to it than that. And so I think that this is an interesting compound, obviously very powerful. A couple of the other things I thought were kind of fascinating coming out of this. Yes, so blood pressure came down, markers of metabolic syndrome, hemoglobin A1C, fasting blood glucose, lipids, triglycerides, cholesterol, all of those things improved. The rate of cardiovascular disease significantly dropped in this study. Now, this is a relatively small trial, so let's take that with a grain of salt. But it is also noteworthy, given that in the history of diabetic medications, a number of drugs that have been very good at lowering blood sugars have not been able to show a reduction in the desired ultimate outcome, which is cardiovascular cardiovascular mortality. The thiazidolizidone drugs, for example, have a bit of a checkered history, shall we say, in this, in that they are effective at reducing the blood glucose and normalizing the hemoglobin A1C, but they were actually associated with an increase in cardiovascular rates and deaths. And so this is moving in the opposite direction, which I think is important, and a reminder that we have to think about the true physiology and the biology of these compounds rather than just looking at surrogate markers of outcome. And the last thing I thought that was really fascinating about this was that even though there was an increased rate of gastrointestinal symptoms, the difference between that and the placebo group was pretty small. So both groups were having gastrointestinal symptoms, which tells you a lot about the placebo effect, I guess, and also probably the frequency of gastrointestinal symptoms in general. But what was really struck by was the reduction in psychiatric events, or psychological events is how they characterize them, which kind of pairs well with the improved mental quality of life that was reported. That was actually of a slightly larger magnitude even than the physical quality of life improvements in this group. And it made me think that, again, so much of our self-identity is tied into weight. And so is it possible that, people are feeling less depressed and less anxious because their body image is improving and they're feeling more confident about themselves? Or is this, possibly an indirect effect of a glucagon stimulating agent that may have pluripotent effects in the brain that could be stimulatory? I mean, what exactly are we looking at here? I would love to understand the mechanism behind that change in sort of mental health well-being, as whether that is a consequence of weight loss or whether that is something more directly due to the drug itself.
Well, so I don't know the answer to that question, of course, but let me pick up a little bit on the general theme there, which is that when I read this study, I didn't find a lot in here to be critical of. There were a few issues that kind of came to my mind, like they used multiple imputation for missing data, but they don't actually tell us how much data was imputed, at least not in the main paper, which I sort of really feel like is an important detail. I was impressed. They had really low loss to follow-up nutrition, low rates of people stopping the medication, so really good follow-through on these drugs. There was a lot to like in here as somebody who is just thinking about the design of the study. They did use a change-based outcome, which I don't truly understand myself, but I know that colleagues who are clinical trial colleagues and causal inference colleagues have issues with change scores and reasons why they can be problematic. I don't totally get it, so I won't fault them for that, though if there's anybody listening who can come on and explain it to us, I would love to hear it. So my mind in reading the study went to, there was sort of more information that I would love. Like it felt like there could have been a little more that we could have learned. So for example, they randomized patients 2-to-1 in this study, 2-to-1 to get the drug, but no explanation really of why 2-to-1. There's nothing, from a methodologic standpoint, you can randomize whatever ratio you want to, but from the sort of the equipoise ethics, argument, you typically would randomize 2-to-1 if you had a more of a belief that the intervention was going to work than that it wasn't. But then I always wonder, if you're going to randomize 2-to-1, is there truly equipoise? But that's a sort of a secondary condition, but I just want to know why 2-to-1. Second of all, they didn't just give them either the drug or the placebo. Everybody also got lifestyle interventions, which makes perfect sense, right? You'd want to counsel people on weight loss and lifestyle interventions as well, but it would be really nice to know whether or not there is any kind of interaction or effect modification by these lifestyle factors. In other words, if you change, but you both take the drug and you exercise more or change your diet, is the effect actually larger, or is there really sort of it's the drug that's doing the heavy lifting, or and you don't get much additional benefit from the lifestyle intervention? So, it felt like that could have been teased out a bit more, and it just would have been useful information to know these things. So, that was my main critique, was I just wanted a little bit more.
Yeah, fair enough.
No, I agree. I was interested in their imputation approach, which they didn't go into detail. Maybe they did in the supplements, but I didn't get that far. But so it's possible they did, and I just didn't see it in terms of the imputation. What I thought was interesting was that so this study, the way they designed it is that the first component of the study, everyone was receiving the medication. Mm-hmm. And then the second component, some people were taken off the medication, given placebo, and some people continued on it. And if you look at, I really like their figures because they detail, you could kind of just quickly, you could glance at the figures and really understand their core finding. But I'm thinking about, as Chris was talking about the mental health experience of participating in this study, it looks like mean body weights really decreased through the first wave where everyone was getting the medication. And then quickly, people started to gain weight again when they were in the placebo group, and people who were in the treatment group continued to lose weight. And so at some point, as that's happening, because the study was taking place over the course of many months, as that was happening, people likely became aware or thought they became aware of whether they were in the treatment group or the placebo group, specifically the people who started to gain weight again. And since that seems so consistent and that was a pretty strong effect, I was interested in kind of the interplay, as Chris was talking about, between the psychological effects of starting to gain weight again after losing weight, and then continued engagement with the lifestyle interventions, or just, kind of continued outlook on life as the benefits you may have seen from the trial are reversed while you're in the placebo arm. And so I would have loved a little more discussion kind of about that psychological component, or a little more kind of, just conversation about how that might have played into some of these very persistent trends that they saw over the study.
Yeah, two things I wanted to follow up there. If in fact people knew which group they were in, obviously that could potentially affect the way that we interpret the results of this trial. And I'm always surprised that it isn't seen as kind of standard practice in clinical trials to ask people which group they think they were in, because if you have a study, this was a study of 800 people, if you ask 800 people which group they were in, and it's more than 50% get the right answer, then you're sort of in the realm of starting to think maybe some of the people did know which group they were in. And, I'm always surprised not to see that. The second thing I wanted to follow up on was I didn't get a sense for why it is they were doing this as a discontinuation study. What is it? I mean, if we have a medication that we know is working, why would you want to discontinue that medication unless there was concern about risk of taking that treatment long term, or the side effects or something like that? So it just wasn't totally transparent to me what it is that was motivating for need for discontinuation. I don't know if either of you got that.
Well, they didn't say. I can hypothesize that my guess is that they were curious to see whether this medication, semaglutide, would somehow have led to a permanent change in the metabolism of these individuals, and you didn't need it anymore. But that doesn't seem to be the case. It seems like being overweight is considered to be a chronic condition, and it looks like the treatment for it is also going to be chronic.
And just to play, devil's advocate, I mean, if I'm in the business of selling semaglutide, wouldn't I want people to stay on this long term? And so what's my motivation for doing a study where I take people off of it?
Yeah. It makes you wonder, was this study done at the behest of a regulator, perhaps, who may have had that same question? Do we need to put patients on a new lifelong medication or not? And it seems like perhaps the answer is, I don't think this study definitively answers the question, but it certainly shows that that weight gain will be a consequence of discontinuing semaglutide.
Yeah, it's funny. You're making me now realize that I didn't actually, this is a case which I normally do, and I didn't read the conflict of interest and disclosures to see where the funding came from.
Do you mind
if
I read
it? It's a really
it?
long section on this paper, right?
Yeah, I want to read it into the record because there are quite a few. Representatives of Novo Nordisk AS, I guess that's what they say, Inc. in Sweden or Norway or whatever it is, were involved in the design and conduct of the study, collection, management, analysis, and interpretation of the data, and preparation, review, and approval of the manuscript. Investigators, so now we're talking about the people whose names are on the leading the paper, were responsible for trial-related medical decisions and data collection, which means that they were taking care of the population. right? But they had no input onto the protocol or the design of the study or the data collection tools at all. And on top of that, Novo Nordisk undertook site monitoring, data collation, and analysis. Two medical writers, Sophie Walton and Paul Barbliss of Axis, a division of Spirit Medical Communications Group Limited, funded by Novo Nordisk, assisted with drafting the manuscript under the direction of the authors. Novo Nordisk did not have the right to veto publication or to control the decision regarding to which journal the manuscript was submitted. And yet, let's stipulate based on that, basically Novo Nordisk did the entire thing.
Does seem like it.
Except for choosing the journal.
Yeah. So that factors into my thinking about it. I don't know exactly what it changes, but it's worth noting. Again, I don't discount studies that are funded by industry. This one seems like it's a bit more heavy-handed than many of the ones we read, but I don't discount them, but I definitely factor that into the way that I interpret the results. All right. Any last thoughts on this one before we move on?
I had just one final thought. I think you were bringing it up, Matt, too, and kind of thinking about why they chose this withdrawal, kind of what was the function of looking at this study. It seemed as if, given the adverse effects, kind of the GI discomfort that a lot of people experienced in the initial run-in phase of the study, that they are looking to cut the dose. And so that was one of my interests in kind of thinking about this withdrawal, like if they're going to continue the withdrawal study, and then within the people who are continuing on the medication, if they're then going to make 2 more arms and reduce the dosage in one of them to kind of see what's the minimum tolerable dose that has an effect on in terms of a maintenance or long-term. So that was my kind of thought as the next step in that. One of the rationales for this withdrawal is that people seem to not tolerate it very well, and so can they make it less frequent? Maybe not once a week, but once every other week or once a month, or I think they're going to experiment with the timing and the dosage to try to see if they can find an amount that more people are comfortable with.
Yeah, and I suspected that was what it was going to be. I just was surprised that it didn't immediately jump out to me what it was.
Yeah.
All right, let's move on to our second segment where we're going to talk about, we're going to use an article as a jumping off point, but I don't think we're necessarily going to focus on the main point of the article. But the article was a comment in The Lancet, and it was commenting on another study. It was entitled "Africa Needs Local Solutions to Face the COVID-19 Pandemic." Baum was the first author. And again, they were commenting on a research piece, but I thought there was some interesting statistics in here, so I just want to read them to you, because this article is basically making the case that, in Africa is going to have to come up with its, solutions to the COVID-19 pandemic that are different from the way that we may have been dealing with it here in the US or countries in Europe or lots of other places. So they note that at the end of 2020, there was a clear asymmetry in the pandemic's toll. 9 countries accounted for 82% of all of the cases reported. Those countries in Africa, and those countries were South Africa, Morocco, Tunisia, Egypt, Ethiopia, Libya, Algeria, Kenya, and Nigeria. So notably, a lot of those are North African countries. Of course, Nigeria, South Africa, and Tunisia are not. I don't know. Ethiopia probably doesn't get considered North Africa. Or does it, Chris?
It's sort of right in the middle. I guess they would call it Horn of Africa.
Yep.
Right.
And 5 countries accounted for 77% of the deaths. So those were South Africa, Egypt, Morocco, Tunisia, and Algeria. So, quite an uneven distribution of COVID cases and COVID deaths, with a big caveat there that assumes that you believe the data. And I think, Chris, that's probably something that you're going to want to talk about. But let's assume for the moment that the data was correct. Then their point being that there is a very uneven distribution, and therefore the approaches that countries are going to take to COVID-19 are going to be different in the different countries. So they say consideration needs to be given as to why Africa is home to 17% of the world population, but only 3.4% of the global COVID-19 cases, and give more statistics out that. But then they note that during the first wave in Africa, nearly all countries implemented stringent measures, whereas only 72% of countries did so during the second wave. So clearly, African countries are reacting differently to the COVID-19 pandemic based, after they've had some experience with it, compared to the way that they acted initially when probably all of us were countries all over the world had very limited information to use to figure out what to do. And so they make the argument that Africa needs to think carefully about how it's going to go about continuing its COVID-19 response, particularly now that we're moving into the time period which more and more Africa is going to have access to vaccines, although we know that that's going to be a slow process. And they make a lot of recommendations like, building on the vaccine distribution programs that already exist in Africa as means for distributing the COVID-19 vaccines. But Chris, I want to start with you because I'm curious whether you believe that what we're seeing in the data in Africa is that truly there is far less COVID and COVID mortality in Africa, or whether you think this is a reporting issue and actually Africa has been hit, maybe not as hard as some of the worst hit countries, but is worse than what is being portrayed, because I know you've done some looks at this.
Yeah. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to stand on my favorite soapbox. So, yes, I do not believe that it is true that Africa has largely been spared from COVID-19. I will qualify that statement by saying that, if we look at how the COVID epidemic hit the United States on a state-by-state basis, we can see that it was very heterogeneous, and there were sort of micro outbreaks and macro outbreaks all over the country that were occurring at different points in time. And so it is normal for there to be some lack of alignment. It's not like everybody's, starts at at a line and then they fire the gun and everybody races and the epidemics sort of take off in parallel. That's not how it works. And so it is entirely believable that there could be, vast regional disparities in how COVID-19 has had an impact on the African continent. But with that saying, we also know that and they say this in the paper, that the surveillance for COVID-19 has really not been very good. And we in Africa, right?
Worldwide.
So we actually worldwide. So we note that prior to the publication of our manuscript in the BMJ just back in January, there was this sort of pervasive narrative about the Africa paradox, and isn't it weird that Africa was spared, and there are all sorts of highfalutin theories flying around about the impact of BCG vaccines and OPV vaccines, and the collective wisdom gained from the Ebola management. All of these things I think are complicated explanations that don't require a complicated explanation, that most of this is just absent or insufficient surveillance data. And when we wrote our paper, we actually, I think, cited the same article that they did in this paper, that, the vast majority of COVID surveillance data came from just 5 or 6 countries in Africa. But that if you counted the total number of COVID-19 tests that had been done cumulatively, it was like 1/30th that of what we see on a per capita basis in the United States. And so it is obvious that there has been under surveillance for this disease.
And Chris, can you tell us what your paper found?
Yeah, so we had been running a post-mortem surveillance study for 3 years looking for a different disease, respiratory syncytial virus, in babies, and trying to understand how many babies were dying of this disease. So when COVID-19 came along, we found ourselves in sort of the right place at the right time, because we had a pretty experienced field team, and we had an on-site molecular lab, and we had good relations with our the host hospital where we were collecting the data, and we were really in a terrific position to simply amend our protocol to expand the age range and add PCR testing for COVID-19. And when we did that, we ended up enrolling about 370 or so individuals who had died. And of those, we were able to get samples out of 362, so just shy of 99%. And we found COVID in 20% of them. And so, the idea that COVID was not there, which was the belief at the time we did the study, was completely untrue. That in fact, COVID was accounting for 1/5 of all deaths in the city across the full age range. And so it was absolutely not true. But what was clear was that almost none of these people had been tested for COVID-19 in life. In fact, out of the 70 individuals who had died of COVID-19, the majority of whom presented with classic symptoms of fever, shortness of breath, and cough. So there's they weren't dying coincidentally with COVID-19; they were dying of COVID-19.
Mm-hmm.
When you look at those 70 individuals, only 6 of them had been tested before they died. So there was a 90% plus underreporting of COVID or underdetection of COVID-19 in this population. It was not rare in the least. And so you say, okay, now we have 2 countries which have actually been doing systematic surveillance. South Africa, which has lots of resources and wealth and expertise, finding a massive impact of COVID-19. Just north of the border in Zimbabwe and Mozambique, nothing. Right?
Yep.
Nothing. So is it that there's really nothing, or is it that you suddenly see that there are no resources for testing and surveillance? And Zambia is in the same situation. The only reason we detected it there was that we happened to have an existing post-mortem cohort study already running that could be amended in 3 weeks and turned into a COVID surveillance site.
Yep. And I certainly share your concern about the data. I suppose I would also say that I think, we're learning from India that you can also have a situation where, it seems like you've been spared, and then all of a sudden things get completely out of control. You can just sort of be lucky in some ways and have put things off for quite a while, but that if you don't have a population that's vaccinated, you're still vulnerable to large outbreaks. Jess, let's assume that my explanation, not that I believe it, but that is the correct one, that the data actually is pretty okay, that Africa hasn't been hit as bad as many other places. I have to say I agree with Chris that there's probably reason to believe that the data isn't that great. But even if it is, what's your reaction to this idea that things will have to be done differently in Africa in terms of how we go about dealing with the pandemic?
Yeah, this is an interesting piece, and I think the original article was interesting too. That this was a commentary about. I mean, this commentary to me was I was reading it as if it was being kind of saying the research world is colonialist. And we need to have an anti-colonialist approach to dealing with COVID in Africa, which in many ways is obvious, but Africa is not a monolith. And, this piece kind of read to me that it was trying to talk to the reader and say, just remember, there are many, many, many different countries and different circumstances and different opportunities for transmission and different economic contexts and different social contexts in Africa. So it's not as if we can think of one solution that's just going to fit the whole continent. And I think, the vaccination initiatives address that in some ways, but this was written, I felt like as I was reading this, it was saying to the reader, just remember your perspective on research in Africa is often colonialist, and that is not going to work in this sort of context as we try to think of, and these countries try to come up with different sorts of ideas and approaches to reduce the effect of the pandemic. But I would say for my own research, we have seen similar sorts of commentaries and then terrible trajectories in Central America. A lot of my research is based in Central America, and there was initially this sense of, Central America is getting spared, and then it was deeply affected, and tremendous amount of undertesting also. And so a lot of the effects were coming from self-reports, were coming from clinicians, were not necessarily coming from this standardized surveillance network that we've seen in high-income countries.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I think that the analogy that Chris made in the beginning to the heterogeneity within the United States, I think is pretty telling here as well, that if we have seen so much heterogeneity even here within the United States, certainly you would expect heterogeneity between countries and continents. And therefore, there's probably, differences in the way that we need to react. And, countries are different in terms of their healthcare infrastructure and in terms of their underlying distribution of comorbidities and all of those things. So, the idea that that everyone would react the way that, one country that did things well would react probably doesn't make a lot of sense. We certainly in the U.S. didn't do that, so we can't claim that we certainly know what we're doing. But the idea seems right on. I think that the challenge is in getting very specific solutions that lead to benefits, particularly as the vaccines are slow in coming to Africa, and we need to do everything we can to speed that up.
I agree. I think that the truth is I felt a little bit cross when reading this editorial and the paper that it referred to, because it seemed to be perpetuating the belief that somehow Africa has been spared. And I think it is more likely than not that is just the product of bad surveillance, and it is a myth. And in some ways you can sort of see how easy it is to fall into that trap, right? Because a lot of what we think we understand about the impact of COVID-19 on a planetary scale comes from places like the Johns Hopkins website, right? Where you have this map that shows in color-coded intensity, the distribution of cases around the world and the density of incidence of cases around the world. But, if you think about like Burkina Faso and Belgium, why would you assume that the provenance of the data that feed into both of those sources is equivalent, right?
I wouldn't.
And yet, yes, you wouldn't. You definitely wouldn't. And yet, the Hopkins website erases all of that nuance because it treats all those reporting sites as equivalent, and that is just not a very good assumption in my view.
Yeah, I guess the one thing I do always wonder about, though, is to a certain extent, surveillance systems aren't necessary for telling us that there is a crisis. In other words, what's happening in India at the moment in terms of massive surge in cases and hospitalizations, you don't need a really good surveillance system. People just identify that things are going badly because hospitals are overwhelmed. And, you haven't heard of tons of reports of countries in sub-Saharan Africa being overwhelmed in their hospitals. You have heard it a little bit in South Africa, but and I accept that part of that may just be that, people aren't making it to the hospital or that the reporting isn't very good. But, it does seem to me there's a little bit of something there.
Mm-hmm. But remember, we're working in two different contexts. So let's say, let's take the University Teaching Hospital in Lusaka and compare it with an equivalently sized hospital here in Boston, say like, the Mass General. Okay, they're both very big hospitals, and I don't know what the actual size of them is, but let's say each of them has about 1,000 beds. Now, at the Mass General, I would think that people are very sick, and some will die. Probably several will die every day. But we're talking about 5 or 10 people dying at Mass General a day. I don't know the actual number, but it's a relatively discrete number, relatively small number. And so if you saw that COVID-19 was causing an additional 10 deaths a day, that would be a 100% increase, and people would be pulling the fire alarm, right? Mm-hmm. But in Lusaka, the baseline rate of mortality is closer to 50 to 60 deaths a day. All right, and so now you have an additional 10, so you've gone from 50 to 60 perhaps, which is a 20% increase. Now, if we saw a 20% increase at the Mass General Hospital, we would get very alarmed, of course. But, in Lusaka, you might not notice that at all because they're not really the statistics are not being used and scrutinized in the same way that they are at the Mass General Hospital because of the lack of resources. In fact, a lot of these statistics would be very hard to tease out. We're trying to do this right now because they're documented in paper logbooks. And so for someone to sort of say, gosh, there seems to have been a 20% increase in overall mortality in the last 3 months, gee, I wonder why, would require someone to have abstracted those logs and compared them with digitized version of those logs going back 2 or 3 years, which is what we are now doing in our ongoing research. But that has not yet been done, you see. And so the assumption that people would simply notice that excess mortality, I think, assumes that we're dealing with the same baseline mortality rate, and we're not.
Yep, I agree with all that. I mean, I think you might notice, though, that if you had more people lined up for hospitalization than you were used to because you're just sort of seeing it. But I get the point that if hospitals are overwhelmed all the time, you may not notice it quite as much. But I still think you'd notice some of it. That's
absolutely you would notice some of it. And the Zambians that we worked with were reporting that last summer the hospital wards were full. Right? But they weren't saying they were full of COVID because they weren't testing for COVID. And the other thing that was interesting about our research is when we looked at the distribution of the deaths, that is to say, what proportion of them were hospital deaths versus what proportion were deaths that occurred in the community, 75% of the deaths occurred in the community outside of medical care. And so that would, again, not have registered as a rush on the medical system because they were dying at home.
Yep.
So you might see it in the morgue, but you're not seeing it on the ward.
Yep. Okay, Jess, any last thoughts before we move on?
No, this is an interesting conversation. I mean, I think one of the things that struck me that I'm sure both of you work more closely with than I do, because your work is based in Africa in part, I think, is the idea of how COVID in an ongoing way interplays with endemic diseases in Africa, and how both the rollout of vaccinations, the uptake of vaccinations, and then also the consequences of survival post-COVID intersect with endemic diseases. So I think, the authors kind of end the article on those points, that it's not just so much that the whole picture ends once vaccine rollout begins, but I think vaccine rollout will continue to be uneven throughout Africa, as it is in other places too. And then the longer term consequences in the context of all comorbidities and endemic diseases will vary by country also.
Yep.
So I think those are also important differences to think about.
Totally agree. Okay, let's move on to our last segment, which is our amazing and amusing. And I'm gonna go first. I got a short one here, but you guys are fans of the comic XKCD?
Oh yeah, I love it.
Have you seen the most recent one on types of scientific papers?
No. I should Google it right now. But describe it.
XKCD is a, for those who don't know, is a great comic that takes on a lot of the problems in science and reproducibility and those types of things. And the most recent one is a 12-paneled set of research papers, and the heading is types of scientific paper, and then each paper has just sort of a title to it that would sort of group them into different categories of scientific papers. And I won't read all of them to you, but there were a few of them that kind of hit home a little bit. So one would be, hey, I found a trove of old records. They don't turn out to be particularly useful, but still cool. Or, my colleague is wrong and I can finally prove it. Or, what are fish even doing down there? or the immune system is at it again. Hey, at least we showed this method can produce results. That's not nothing, right?
Yeah.
A lot of, and the final one, we scanned some undergraduates.
That's awesome.
And some thoughts on how everyone else is bad at research.
Yep.
Sounds.
I think we're guilty of that one.
Sounds familiar. Familiar. So that would just crack me up. The other reason I wanted to bring this one up is because it's, of course, really funny, but it has prompted a bunch of other people, including Jess, your department chair, to make versions of their own for their particular subfield. So if you go on to Twitter and just look for the XKCD of this, you can also find a lot of the additional ones that people are creating that are very funny.
Oh, that's great.
All right, Chris, what do you got for us?
Okay, well, I'm going to talk about the Coriolis effect.
Ooh.
Okay, so
all right.
For those who may not remember their earth science class back in middle school, the Coriolis effect applies whenever you have a body that is spinning, and how the spinning of that thing that you're on affects the motions or the apparent motions of the things that are sitting on the surface of that spinning thing, whether it's a record player or whether in the case of it's the globe itself, the world itself spinning around in space. And so this is what makes storms and weather air currents spin in a counterclockwise direction north of the equator and a clockwise direction south of the equator. So that's the Coriolis effect. And in case you're wondering who Coriolis was, he was an engineer, I think a French engineer, who was back in the 19th century and noticed that when you were firing very, very, very long cannons and testing them out above the equator, they tended to land, and firing north, they tended to land slightly to the right of where you were aiming, and south they landed slightly to the left of where you're aiming. And so he assumed that this was probably because of the rotation of the planet. And we're talking about shells that had a range of like 75 miles, because it is a very small effect. And in case you're wondering, the effect of the Coriolis effect compared with that gravity is that the Coriolis effect is only 30 millionths that of gravity. So it is a very, 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 very small effect. Now, the reason I bring this up is that I found a YouTube video of a bunch of entrepreneurial young guys in Uganda who had set up a series of stalls just along the Ugandan the equator running through Uganda. And there were all sorts of like equator-themed things going on at this site. And one of them was that they had people who had a bucket of water with a hole in the bottom and a cork. And then they would show that the water went down counterclockwise north of the line and clockwise when you walked it over to the south of the line. And I was like so skeptical. This just seems like the Coriolis effect is so small. How can this possibly be true? Mm-hmm. And I started collecting my own data. So I would watch the water going down the drain in my shower. And I've been doing this for about a year now. And I can tell you it goes clockwise half the time and counterclockwise half the time. And sometimes you see it change directions, like right in front of you. And the thing that seems to matter the most is where my feet are. So, and anyway, I went on to Wikipedia and they said, in fact, it is a complete myth that the Coriolis effect has any meaningful effect on the way that water goes down your sink or your toilet, because there are so many local effects that are far more important than the Coriolis effect, such as where you put your feet. So I was then curious, like, how does one study the Coriolis effect in a scientific way? And so there was an MIT scientist called Asher Shapiro, who back in 1962, which was the same year that Watson and Crick published their paper about DNA, he did this seminal study using a giant bathtub on the campus of MIT to prove the Coriolis effect. But he had this very elaborate sort of study design where he had to like regulate the temperature of the room, because you don't want the room air to be warmer or colder than the water, because it will cause currents in the water, which will obliterate the Coriolis effect. It is that subtle. So, and on top of that, you had to make sure there was no air. So we put this sort of special, one assumes, air permeable covering over it to make sure that there was no wind being applied to this bathtub, and to sort of make sure that the water was perfectly still. He filled the bathtub and then left it for 24 hours before he pulled the cork. And it went counterclockwise. And when they repeated this, he had a set of colleagues in South America. When they repeated this exact experiment south of the border, they could show that went clockwise down the bathtub with an identical experimental model. But the conclusion here was that this myth that this is the way it is and it always goes that way in your sink or in your toilet is completely untrue, even though the Coriolis effect does exist. And now the way that the Coriolis effect is studied, because it is difficult to do this research, is to create your own spinning disk. And so they, rather than try to study the effect of the Earth spinning slowly, you have you would use a parabolic dish where it spins around, and you set it to spin at just the right speed such that the standing object that you put on it is not going to go flying off or sink to the middle. You want the centripetal force to balance gravity on this parabola. And then once you have precisely balanced those two things, then you can study the Coriolis effect, which is the residual. And they do this using hockey pucks made out of dried ice.
Hockey pucks made of dried ice.
Right, which are practically frictionless.
Oof. Okay.
And then you can see that the hockey pucks will actually rotate in a circle rather than going round and around like a carousel. The Coriolis effect will actually have them go in little mini circles rather than following the perimeter of the parabola.
Chris, you're kind of blowing my mind here, because I was always taught that if you wake up in a strange place and you don't know where you are, the first thing you should do is to flush the toilet to make sure you're in the right hemisphere.
Totally untrue.
Totally untrue.
Might not be a bad idea anyway.
The direction of the toilet flush spiral is a function of the shape of the toilet.
Well, now what am I going to do if I wake up in a strange place?
I don't know. I think you're going to have to look to see if you see the Southern Cross at night.
Okay. All right. There you go. All right. Well, thanks for that. Jess, what do you got for us?
On that note, well, I have something much less intellectual, so I'm glad to be going after Chris. This was a funny story that came across my news feed. It got some media attention, so maybe you both saw it. The overgrown sheep. Did you see this?
No.
There was a...
No.
So sheep, some of my work has to do with domesticated animals and food production animals, and so that was probably why this one came over my news feed. But sheep are domesticated, right? They're not wild animals. But in Australia, a couple of months ago, they found a a sheep that had escaped. It either had escaped or it had been intentionally let loose from its farm environment and had not been shorn, and it was unclear, but probably many, many years. And this sheep was like walking, kind of walking in the, through the fields, and people thought it was like some sort of, scary alien creature, or it was the
Monster.
Yeti, or it was something. But it was right. It was carrying almost 80 pounds of wool.
Wow.
And so it was interesting. So I don't know, it's like a natural experiment. What happens to a sheep if it's not shorn for long periods of time? Like, does the wool just... Anyway, the answer is that at least for this particular sheep, the wool just continues to grow and grow and grow. And anyway, they put some pictures up online, and it's like it can hardly see. It's like it's a frightening animal.
I was going to say, could it walk?
It could walk, but it looked like I can't even describe it. It's like, because the wool gets so matted too, it almost looks like the poor thing is like wearing trash, right? Because it's like all matted down. But then the story ended in a happy way where they sheared the sheep, and then they put a little jacket on him, and he's like so happy now. He's got this little blue jacket, and I don't know, he went back to live on a farm, but
wow,
I don't know. It was making me think of, animals that are domesticated that people take on during the pandemic. This was like slightly unrelated. And then they're going to, like chickens, for example, backyard chickens have been exploding because of the pandemic, and everyone wants chickens.
Wait.
Yeah.
Not literally exploding.
Not literally exploding.
The phenomenon, demand for. Yeah, sorry, no, chickens are not exploding. But no, the idea that, people are getting chickens because they're home a lot, and then eventually we're not all going to be home a lot. And so when you take on these animals, then... Yeah.
Well, I gotta say, I'm actually quite concerned about my dog, who we've had for 13, 14 years now. But I'm concerned when we all go back to work that he's going to be lonely, because we've had us around the house for a year and a half. I'm going on 2 years almost by the time. Well, I guess a year and a half. But yeah, I worry about these pets.
Do you want to borrow my clippers?
No,
the ones I use to shave my head. Nope. Okay.
Well, that is the end of our program. If you got any feedback on this or any other episode, or you want to suggest a study or a topic for us to take on, you can tweet us at @PopHealthyX, or you can tweet me at @ProfMattFox, or Don at DTheo1, or Chris at ID.Gill, or you can find us on the Population Health Exchange website at www.pophealthyx.org. We want to thank...
Does Jessica have a Twitter handle as well?
No, that's why I didn't give her...
I don't.
Yeah.
People are welcome to email me if they'd like.
But you can just send tweets to random Twitter accounts and see if they get to Jess.
Let's just post your cell phone.
Good try.
Yeah, let's do that. That's a great idea.
I know, that's an even better idea.
We want to thank Leslie Talali, an Assistant Dean of Lifelong Learning at the BU School of Public Health, for supporting the podcast, and Nick Guler for sound and editing. Thanks for joining us. We hope you enjoyed it, and we hope you will download our next episode.